Georgia voters broke the state's midterm record on the very first day of early voting. Over 133,000 people hit the polls to cast their votes, far eclipsing 2018's turnout of 71,000.
Early voting is up nationwide, according to the University of Florida's U.S. Elections Project. Over 20 million early votes have been counted, including mail-in ballots. Midterm turnout hasn't kept up with voters who come out to vote in presidential elections, but recent midterms prove voter participation is increasing. Here to break down what's behind this shift is Nick Morrow, the communication director for vote.org. Thank you for joining us, Nick.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
So, a lot of early voting. What's going on with that? Tell us.
A lot of early voting, yes. I think we are seeing a lot of enthusiasm in this midterm election. 2018 was a really exceptional year when it came to turnout, and we're really seeing that is on pace to be met or even exceeded with this 2022 election cycle. Here at vote.org, we provide platforms that allow voters to register, verify their registration, request a mail-in ballot, finding their polling location, and more. And we've already seen in the state of Georgia specifically that we have had more visitors to the website than we had in the entire 2018 cycle. So it's really an exceptional uptick, given that there are still, 5 days until the election. So it seems like voters are really excited to turn out, and they already are with early voting. And I think we'll see the same thing on Election Day.
So, Nick, is the presumption that high turnout in early voting benefits Democrats?
It's hard to tell. I think that we live in a sort of exceptional time in terms of turnout, where there are more and more options for voters in general to head to the polls. There are longer times that you can go and vote early. There are more polling locations that are open. And I think voters are really getting used to voting early, voting by mail. I think that, it remains to be seen who that benefits, but it's a net positive overall that more people are able to exercise their right to vote early and also do it by mail ahead of Election Day, where we assume that turnout is also going to be high.
In 2020, there was this push by Donald Trump to not have his voters vote early or by mail. There's this weird politicization that happened around COVID where it was almost a point of pride to vote in person and defy the warnings about the dangers of catching COVID at the voting booth. And that presumably affected the kind of tallies in the early voting and advantaged Democrats. Are you still seeing any of that? And is that, one of the calculations as you're thinking about whether or not this early voting bodes well for the Democratic candidates in the state?
I think it remains to be seen, but I do think that, people have gotten more experience voting early, more experience voting by mail, and sort of understand that you have to make a multi-pronged plan to make sure that your vote is counted on or before Election Day. So I think that it'll be an interesting test case, especially in the state of Georgia, where turnout was so exceptionally high in 2020, and there was the runoff after the general election, which, could happen again. So I think it remains to be seen, but I do think that it's a positive for both parties, really, that people are making multiple plans to get out and vote, whether that's early or in person.
Do you think people are just getting more excited and interested in what's going on in national politics, so they feel more is at stake for them personally? Historically, we used to think that, okay, people might vote in the presidential election, then there's going to be a lot fewer people voting in an off year or midterm election. But now, with the sort of national media narrative being about how every election is the most important election in our lifetimes, including, this one where we're not even choosing a new president, that I think eventually has an effect, right? Where people have been convinced of that it's this important for everyone to vote every time.
Right, absolutely. And, I think that this election cycle is particularly interesting because there is so much going on politically. You have the overturning of Roe v. Wade, you have the January 6th hearings, you have sweeping action from the Biden administration around student loans. I think that the political environment is very different as to what people thought it would be at the beginning of the year. And because of that, you're seeing people who are motivated on either side of each of those issues and more, really, really wanting to make their voices heard. And I think especially in places like Georgia in particular, and other states that have passed some of these more restrictive voter suppression laws since the 2020 cycle, I think you're seeing sort of a snapback effect where people still want to make sure that they can do everything in their power to get out there and vote. And I think that has a real magnifying impact on the vote totals, especially in a midterm year where, as you said, we're not electing a president, but people know that these folks will have really consequential impact on the politics until the presidential election, including electing people who will be the folks that certify the 2024 presidential election. That's a very important calculus, and I think people understand that.
Nick, voter disenfranchisement was such a big part of the story in 2020 and in 2018. Stacey Abrams in particular made that kind of the star of her kind of political presence. It's voting rights is something that she's pursued and started foundations to resolve. So many of the cases that she brought to litigation have been recently decided unsuccessfully for her. And I wonder what you make of the kind of gap between Democratic messaging on voter disenfranchisement and these historically high rates of turnout.
Sure. I think that people, especially in Georgia, where I think the voter disenfranchisement and sort of the laws that are aiming to restrict people's right to vote, I think people are really taking that to heart and making sure that the next time around when they are electing the people who will represent them, that is something that they take very seriously. I think people understand, that since 2020, there have been 19 states that have passed new restrictive voting laws. And this is something that people just across the board don't support. And they understand that the people that they put in power in their state now have a real impact on what that's going to mean for the presidential election. So I think that people are waking up to that fact. And I think that people take it very seriously and are also understanding as voters that they have the power, right, to be able to change this. 2020 was just such a banner year for negative voter suppression laws that this will be a really interesting election and seeing how people respond to that, both as voters in terms of making their own plans and in terms of electing the people who will either be in charge of enforcing those laws or overturning them.
Well, Nick Morrow, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you both.
And we'll have more Rising right after this.